Do you ever find yourself looking for a fresh way to grow? Well, today I want to share with you what I believe may be one of the most overlooked growth practices that you may be missing out on. So stay tuned because today I'm going to tell you what it is and how you can maximize it. Over the past 30 years, I have been passionate about personal growth and studying personal growth. And here's what I've discovered. If you want to grow bigger in your character or your leadership competencies, one of the best things you can do is get around big people. A big person is someone whose character you admire. It's someone who's had bigger experience than you, bigger success than you, bigger ideas than you, bigger network than you, a bigger faith than you. It's someone who has a bigger company or a bigger team or a bigger influence or a bigger vision than yours. When I was 27 years old, I had the opportunity to work for a pastor in Dallas, Texas, who was what I would call a big leader. He was in his mid-40s and he'd accomplished what most people would have been happy to accomplish in a lifetime. And he had big influence, big vision, and big character. And most of all, he had a big influence on my life. In chapter 12 of the book of Hebrews, the author gives us some insights into getting around big people. And he writes this, he says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses," big people, "let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles us, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us." Now, I love this verse because it reminds me of three things. First, it reminds me that big leaders are a model for me to look to. God wants me to look at the life and the faith of other great leaders. In today's culture, it seems like it's hard to find a hero to model yourself after. But in this verse, we're reminded that we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. We're surrounded by great people. The Greek word he uses here for surrounded has the idea of a high wall that completely encircles you. In other words, it's hard to miss. A wall that completely surrounds you and encircles you, it's hard to miss that wall. But sometimes we miss the most obvious things that surround us. So maybe you're having a hard time finding somebody to mentor you. Maybe you're having a hard time finding a big leader to learn from. Well, don't miss out on the obvious things. Great leaders have written books that you can read, podcasts that you can listen to. They've got courses you can sign up for. Now, obviously, the best scenario is to learn from somebody in person. So sometimes I just challenge young leaders, take a risk. Email somebody you admire and let them know that you'd like to learn from them and just ask them for a 30-minute meeting or phone call. Don't fail to capitalize on this growth approach just because you don't know them personally. All right, now the second thing this verse reminds me of is big leaders inspire me to make big changes. The author goes on to say, let us throw off everything that hinders us. As we go through life, it's easy to pick up some bad habits, some wrong attitudes, or sinful patterns that can hold us back from maximizing our leadership effectiveness. This is why it's important that we get around big leaders. Every time I'm around a big leader, I see changes I need to make in my own life. The third thing that I see in this verse is big leaders show me how to finish strong. Guys, the lives and example of big leaders can motivate us to keep the course when leadership gets tough. And there are times when we want to quit, right? But when we look at those we admire and we see the struggles they've been through and we see how they handle it, it can inspire us to finish strong. Cindy and I had the opportunity just a few years ago to go to Rwanda for a full week with Pastor Rick Warren from Saddleback Church. And it was about a year after his son Matthew had committed suicide. Now, on this trip, I was so impressed because he spoke openly and honestly about the experience. And his pain was evident, but so was his passion and so was his perseverance. And as I sat and I listened to him share about the experience, share about the pain, and hear his perspective on God's perspective on his life in that moment, it made my problems and struggles pale in comparison. And it served as a great example of how to continue to lead strong in the midst of trials and trust God to help me finish strong regardless of what might happen in my life. I've learned that it's important for me to get around big leaders because it gives me a clear picture of the whys and hows required to lead at a big level. Several years ago, I established an annual discipline that I call Learning from Giants. Each year, I write down the names of 2 or 3 giants or big leaders that I want to learn from. I email those individuals and I ask them for a meeting by phone call or to meet with them in person. And I've discovered that big leaders typically are very generous with their time and they want to find a way to help you. And this has proven to be one of the most productive growth disciplines in my life. Now, let me give you a few tips so you can take full advantage when you have a chance to meet with a big leader. Tip number 1 is prepare a list of questions in advance. When you go into this meeting, be ready with some great questions. Ask questions that enable you to learn from both their success and their failures. All right, here's a few of my favorites. All right, what leader has most influenced your leadership style? What was the most significant thing you learned from that person? What's the biggest leadership mistake you made? And how did that leadership mistake shape you as a leader? What's been your greatest leadership success? What did you learn from that success? What are you reading? That's a huge question I always ask. And then who else do I need to know that you can introduce me to that I can learn from? Always go into these types of meetings with a list of questions because it shows you're serious about learning from them and it shows you know very specifically what you want to learn from them as well. Tip number 2 is listen more than you talk. Back in the late 80s when I was at Dallas Seminary, Dr. Howard Hendricks was my favorite professor. And I remember I finally worked up the courage to ask for a meeting with him. So his assistant scheduled me for a 15-minute meeting. And it was like a month away. So the long-awaited day finally came, and I went in and I looked him in the eyes and sat down in the chair and I thanked him for meeting with me and I began to tell him about myself. After about 14 minutes, he stopped me and he said, "Mac, we have 1 minute left. Do you have a question for me?" Ouch. I lost out on a great opportunity in that moment, and I learned a valuable lesson. All right. Don't try to impress them with who you are or what you've done. Just introduce yourself, give 2 basic facts about yourself, tell them that you're there to learn from them, and then just start asking questions and shut up and take notes. All right. And that leads us to tip number 3, which is take notes. So whenever you ask to meet and learn from somebody, make sure you take a pen and a notebook into that meeting. There's nothing more dishonoring than asking to learn from somebody and then sit there across from them and not ask questions and not take notes as they're sharing their best wisdom from their experience. So have your questions pre-written, and then as they share their answers, write down the gold that they're going to share with you. One of the giants I met with last year, he's a very busy man. I had 15 questions. I sat down with him, introduced myself, said, "Hey, I got 15 questions. Here's the thing I want to learn from you." And I'd ask the question, listen, write down notes. And it's a great way you can honor those you're learning from. And then tip number 4 is follow up. After your meeting, send them a personal note or an email thanking them for their time. Honor their investment by letting them know what action steps you're going to take as a result of what you learned from them. And thank them and then let them know the specific difference their investment made in your life. Now, not only will these steps honor the investment they made in you, but it's going to make them more likely to say yes if you request a second meeting. So let me ask you this. As we talked about this, did a big leader come to mind that you want to learn from? What's your next step? Take a minute, write down that next step while this teaching is fresh in your mind. And if you can get around that big leader, I want to tell you something. I guarantee you, if you get around that big leader, you're going to see yourself grow bigger. Thanks again for joining me for this week's video, and I'll see you next Tuesday.